here to my left, my favorite federal district judge in the planet, right here, John Keenan, everyone.
I must have ruled for you. I guess I ruled for you a couple of times, all right?
Every time. And over there is my favorite film critic in the nation, who is, in fact, the film critic for the nation, Stuart Claywans. And over there in the center is a legend's daughter, who is herself a extremely great actress and a filmmaker and a producer, Cecilia Peck. Now, just to prove that Gregory Peck actually had more than one child, there may even been three. Is there actually a third, or is there just two?
We have two older half-brothers.
Ah, okay. Cecilia's brother, Anthony Peck, is here in the front row. So let us begin with this incredibly iconic film. Let's start with you, Stuart. It is indeed an iconic film, and it resonates with everyone based on an iconic novel. Is it a great film?
Is it a great film? I think it's a greatly reassuring film, and I think that's one of the reasons that it resonates with people so much.
But reassuring, it's interesting because it breaks so many of the Hollywood conventions. It has a decidedly unhappy ending.
I don't know that the ending is so unhappy.
I was hoping you would challenge that premise.
I think that it's essentially a movie about two boogeymen, and one of the boogeymen turns out to be nice and is Robert Duvall with hair and a little mascara. And the other boogeyman gets to die, so he's polished off. And I mean, the last thing you hear in the film is it's going to be morning. Summer follows summer, and it's going to be morning, and the boy will wake up. And along the way, there's this very humble black man who did a foolish thing and ran away and got killed for it off screen. So in that sense, it is a reassuring film. If you put it in the context of other things that were happening in 1962, you see the contrast. I'm playing contrarian here, forgive me, I can't help it, it's what I do for a living.
No, that's good. Although we're going to come back to it is a decidedly unhappy film from the perspective of the defendant, Tom Robinson.
Yes.
And so to the extent to which this is considered one of the quintessential films about the legal system, you have an innocent man. And so let's go back to our federal judge and say, Judge Keenan, this is a horrible legal result. And have you ever seen a trial like this?
No. But of course, I'm the only one in the room who was alive in 1932 when the crime allegedly occurred. I might note, and I would talk to the people who know something about films, there's one thing in the film that is historically inaccurate, and it's very interesting. I watched the film Sunday night at home. I got home from the Giant game, and I watched the film. Then I watched it again tonight. You remember at the beginning of the movie, Scout talks about, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, and it was the summer of 1932.
A little early?
Roosevelt didn't say that until March of 1933. So the film was wrong historically. Interestingly, I don't know anything about movies. That has nothing to do with law, but
Now, what about such a flimsy verdict based on such extraordinarily circumstantial evidence?
the evidence was not even circumstantial. There was no evidence of rape. The woman never testified she was raped. As Atticus said in his summation, there's no medical evidence whatsoever. The verdict was ridiculous. The verdict was absurd. But it reflected the South, whether that was Mississippi or Georgia. I kept hearing Macomb. I couldn't figure it was Macon, Georgia, or Macomb.
It's actually Macomb, Alabama.
Oh, well, there I was.
It's Macomb County, right?
Alabama is right.
Right.
Alabama's right between Mississippi and Georgia, so I was close. I could never figure, and I didn't look it up, but the verdict was reflective of the times. There's no question that would have been the verdict had there been such a trial, but there's no question that in reality, Gregory Peck's Atticus Finch's summation was a wonderful summation, and the way he did it was terrific. And with an impartial jury, sure, he would have been acquitted. And they don't have the time in a film to show you emotions at the end of the prosecution's case. But the case should have been dismissed at the end of the prosecution's case on the theory there was no evidence of a rape. There was no testimony about a rape. He took advantage of me. I mean, that sounds like a song.
All right, before we talk to Cecilia Peck, let's watch a different kind of a movie. Roll this next clip. Drop. Lights, please.
Please feel free to ask me anything you want. I mean, you ask the questions you want, and I'll give the answers that I want. Now, up here.
Mr. Peck, do you have a favorite role?
Oh, sure. It's Atticus Finch, sure. Oh. That was my lucky day when Alan Pakula and Bob Mulligan sent me the book. And they said, I think this is something you're going to like. Well, I sat up all night reading the book. I could hardly wait for 8 o'clock in the morning to call them and say, if you want me, I'm your boy. And of course, I've never had a moment's regret. And on the contrary, it was a blessing and a gift from Harper Lee.
I don't think that's all the reading for tonight. I think it's getting late.
What time is it?
8:30.
May I see what?
Okay. So that film, that documentary, was made by Cecilia Peck, who is also an award-winning documentarian. I don't know if your partner's here. Barbara, is she here?
I think she might be hiding back there.
Well, half the team of this film, Barbara, it's Capel, right?
It's Barbara Koppel, and can I just say that I'm so glad Barbara's here. Barbara is, in my view, the very greatest American documentary filmmaker that we have, whose films really go to the heart and soul of the characters in them. And Barbara is my working colleague and great friend of the last 10 years, and we made a conversation with Gregory Peck, a documentary about my father, together. Thank you for being here, Barbara.
Thank you, Barbara. So you are the offspring of a national monument. I wonder, I mean, the film in many ways is not just the portrait of a lawyer, but the portrait of a lawyer father. And yet this, in fact, was your father. Were you indeed raised by Atticus Finch?
Well, whenever I've been asked what was my father really like, it's in a way the best way to describe him is that he was very much like Atticus. He was deeply honorable, and he had the courage of his convictions. He wasn't afraid to stand up for the things he believed in. I want to say about the film that the book was written about the South in the 1930s, at a time where the attitudes of racial prejudice were very prevalent. And when it was made in the early 60s, I think it was a very groundbreaking film at that time to take on those subjects head on. But my father often made films that dealt with issues that other films hadn't, or that maybe other actors hadn't been willing to take on, like Gentleman's Agreement, and a film called On the Beach about nuclear proliferation. And in his own life also, he wasn't afraid to be a leader in the civil rights movement, and later take on his feelings that we should not be involved in the Vietnam War. So he really was a lot like Atticus. He was a very strict father with us. It was important to him to instill in all his children, I think, a sense of character and a work ethic. He also was very humorous. He had a great Irish wit that I don't think you see so much in Atticus and not very often in his films. But Barbara and I tried to show that side of him when we made the documentary about him, and that was a part of him that was a real privilege to grow up with as well.
Was it difficult as an actress growing up as Gregory Peck's daughter?
Well, I think my father, as you said, was very monumental to live up to in every way. But no, he was, an inspiration, and I think his work was so subtle. I think he was at his absolute best in this film, and it's what I tried to strive for when I was acting. I did make a film with him when I played his daughter, it was just very. I was lucky to be able to work with him both in that film and making the documentary.
What about this idea of the relationship between the moral man and the moral attorney? The last film we screened was Reversal of Fortune. Some of you may have been in the room. And we talked about how everything about that film is almost the anti-Atticus. And yet that too is a portrait of a lawyer, but a different kind of lawyer. And so, Judge, I don't know if you saw that film. I don't know if you're an Alan Dershowitz fan. Do you like Alan Dershowitz, by the way? Sorry, Bill, I couldn't handle this. Stop it.
I refuse to answer.
But what about this idea, Judge, about these portraits of lawyers?
Press me about Dershowitz.
All right, I won't. I would not. I wouldn't push.
I was at a debate here one time, right in this room where Dershowitz was here. No, I'm not a fan of Alan Dershowitz.
Okay.
But that has nothing to do. That has nothing to do with Reversal of Fortune or this wonderful movie that we saw tonight. I don't think I saw Reversal of Fortune, but I must say this: that there's nothing wrong with being a moral lawyer. In the film, Gregory Peck plays a perfectly appropriate lawyer who does what he has to do for his client and who has courage, who has backbone, and is the personification of what a lawyer should be. He takes an unpopular case in a community where he knows he's going to lose. I mean, there's no chance of his winning, and he knows that when he takes the case. And I thought the scene where he tells his daughter, Scout, don't fight, don't fight. It reminded me of what happened with another Robinson when Branch Rickey hired Jackie Robinson to play first for Montreal in the International League, and then he was going to play for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And the one thing Rickey told Robinson, Jackie Robinson, is don't fight, because they're going to do terrible things to you, which they did to Jackie Robinson. The things they did in baseball to Robinson was incredible. As I said, I'm the only person in the room who was alive in 1932. And I saw Robinson the first season he played at the Polo Grounds up here against the Giants. And some of the stuff they pulled with Robinson was incredible. And when Finch, which was interesting, I wondered whether Harper Lee, and you folks may know this, was it purposeful that his name was Finch, the same, a bird, like Mockingbird? Is there some significance to that, or is that just accident? I wondered that as I watched the film. But in any event, he's a perfectly moral lawyer, and there's nothing inconsistent with being a tremendous advocate and being a moral lawyer. Dean Traynor is going to make an award in about 2 or 3 weeks to a man by the name of Robert Fisk, who's receiving the Stein Prize from our school, which is the most distinguished prize for lawyers or judges that can be given. And it respects ethics. Robert Fisk is the epitome of ethics. And he's a great lawyer. He's defended people who are guilty. He's defended people who he's gotten off, and he's done wonderful jobs. There's nothing inconsistent with being moral and a good lawyer.
Well, but it's not really the way people perceive lawyers.
Well, that's because of Hollywood. And television. And television.
That they perceive them differently than they actually.
Because the man always bites the dog. You don't want to see a good lawyer on television who's an honest person. It's not going to sell.
Stuart, the fact that it's in black and white, any significance to you, for you? Could have been in color.
Less likely. You know, it wasn't an easy film to produce, and I believe you could probably tell me more about this, but I believe Universal really wasn't ready to go for it. It was produced independently by Pakula and Mulligan, and I doubt that they would have been able to do it if Gregory Peck hadn't signed on to it. It was really his agreement to play the role of Atticus Finch that allowed them to raise the money and to get the distribution.
Cecilia, do you have any idea why the film had such a difficult time with studios?
I think that it wasn't perceived as being a potentially commercial film or story at all at the time. And I think it was my father who helped get it financed and made. And I know that Alan Pakula and Bob Mulligan always had my father in mind. They didn't even think about anyone else. And you know, and they've told me that he had that kind of quiet integrity and decency that was Atticus, and that he fit the role perfectly. But you know, just a few years ago, the American Film Institute voted Atticus Finch the #1 film hero of all time. So
I don't have any quarrel with that.
ahead of Indiana Jones and everyone else.
Oh, I think he's much better than Indiana Jones, even than Rick in Casablanca. I think he's much better. The one thing I'd like to ask you people, if I can ask you a question.
Well, but which people are we talking about?
All of you.
Okay.
All right, now, we all saw the movie, and we were all talking about how wonderful and moral the movie was. And there's no question that the role played by Gregory Peck was a moral role. But wasn't the end of the movie a big switch and a big change? Didn't the end tell us that the end justifies the means? Because it was clear that the villain, that was a great part, the villain's part. That's the role I like to play. That villain was I mean, that was the easiest part ever played in Hollywood, was the villain in this movie. The villain didn't stab himself, and he didn't fall on the knife. And Atticus and the sheriff covered it up, didn't they? And didn't that? So doesn't the movie then begin to contradict the question? And I ask you as a film critic, doesn't it contradict this proposition that everything is very moral?
Well, that's what I mean about the context. In 1962, to make a happy resolution, 1962, mind you, on a Southern sheriff's deciding that he's going to decide what the evidence is and what crime was committed. This is the era of Bull Connor. And this is a little, that's why I say that it's a reassurance machine in a certain way. However, as far as the villain goes, Gregory Peck played much better villains than this guy.
Hey, you know what's my
I would
favorite?
give him, yeah.
Boys from Brazil, by the way, is my favorite
Duel
villain.
in the Sun.
All right, whatever. But you know, Your Honor, and I want to really talk to Cecilia and Stuart about this, because I think the ending means the exact opposite. I'm troubled by the fact that what you extol or proclaim as, and I do too, and my students all do to the extent to which they're here, that you have this image of the moral attorney who at the end of the film is actually quite prepared to have some investigation and prosecution of his son. And when my students and I talk about this film, we always see this as morality to an extreme, that there's something here a little creepy about the father who knows that Bob Ewell deserves to die. There isn't anybody who deserves to die more than Bob Ewell. And we know that Boo Radley is ultimately the hero. He's not really scary after all. And yet Atticus, his sense of righteousness requires that we don't forget the truth, that we discover the truth, you know, regardless of where the truth points. And I think that there's something really, when Cecilia said, well, he was strict, I went, whoa, how strict? Because that's an extraordinary scene, right? And I mean, I wonder whether you have any thoughts about that. I'm sure you've thought about this before, that Atticus Finch is quite prepared to do the right thing, not only in risking his sort of career and his reputation, he goes against what the community wants, but even his own family.
Well, I'm not sure if the issue is whether he believes that Jem might have. I mean, I think
It's not that he believes it, that he's prepared to have him endure it.
Well, I mean, I think he knows that he talks about whether Jem is 12 or 13. He knows that his son won't be prosecuted for this crime. I think he's saving Boo Radley from that kind of humiliation of being put in the spotlight. But I think the ending suggests that, that he's human too, that he's capable of saying yes to covering up the truth, and that in someone who is human and perhaps flawed, there's still, you can still be heroic and noble.
You have a thought to that, Judge?
I think Cecilia summed it up beautifully.
Good.
You
Excellent.
can be a hero, you can be noble, but you're still human, and Finch was human. And what he did was theoretically improper. He was going to sacrifice his son, and then, as has been said, the sheriff took it all away and had the villain fall on his own knife. But I think Cecilia summed it up. And I think that that's one of the reasons the movie was so good. I said, I think to Dean Traynor, I watched, and I think I said it here, I watched it for Sunday night and I watched it again tonight. And I used to say that it was like the 5th or 6th best movie I ever saw. I always believed Casablanca was the best. This has now moved up in my mind to about a tie with Casablanca. I mean, it is.
Is that because you're sitting next to Cecilia Peck? No, it's about Cecilia Peck. Just tell us the truth.
But I made that determination. I got it up to 2 Sunday night, and now it's up to
Is
tie.
it still climbing?
Well, it's tied. It's tied. But
Anthony, get up here.
it's a. I mean, it's a fantastic movie. I mean, her father and Andrew's father is so good in this, and there was talk about. She said that he was humorous. There were times there where Atticus was humorous in a little way. I mean, he knew darn well the kids had caused a lot of problems the night of the shooting. Remember? Before, it has nothing to do with Robinson. The night of the shooting, he knows that, and all he does is pat him on the fanny and says, "Go to bed." He damn well knew what happened.
Let's take another look at the Koppel-Peck film. Another clip.
Now up here, please.
Mr. Peck, when I was 13 years old, I saw To Kill a Mockingbird. And it was such a seminal event in my life that as soon as I saw it, I knew that I wanted to become a lawyer. But not only was it to me a movie about a lawyer, but it was also, more importantly to me, about a father. And when my first son was born, I named him Atticus, and became a lawyer. Today, before I left to come here, across from my office, I took out of a frame an original To Kill a Mockingbird poster. And I was wondering if it's possible, if sometime that you could sign that for me.
Oh, my father's answer was, how about tonight?
Oh, is that right? All right. How about tonight? Let's hear it.
Thane, I just, I forgot that I had a little, there's something my father said about making the film and
Please,
playing Atticus
read
Finch.
it.
Can I just
Yes,
share
please.
it?
Yes, please.
He said, I just put everything I had into it, all my feelings and everything I'd learned in 46 years of living about family life and fathers and children, and my feelings about racial injustice and equality and opportunity.
Fabulous.
So I just wanted to share that because I think that he did put so much of himself into it. But I think that in the way, and maybe it happens in the law too, when you take on a case that you put a lot of yourself into, that case also makes you who you hope to be. That I think Atticus became him too in the same way. And
Well, you know, that's interesting. I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
That's interesting to us here because, you know, we don't want lawyers to be split from their moral selves. We want lawyers to be righteous and kind and caring and human and compassionate. We don't want them to think of it as a job. We want them to personalize their lives. The idea that, what you read to me makes me think that Gregory Peck, one of America's finest actors, wasn't necessarily acting on that day, that he was Atticus Finch. But there was a character that truly meant sense to him internally. We know anecdotally, and Dean Traynor mentioned it at the beginning, at the outset of the film, that more student essay applications to law schools invoke Atticus Finch as a model than anything else that anyone ever wants to write about. They don't write about any pot conviction that happened to their father, which is probably the real reason they're going to law school. They don't, at least for the purposes of when it comes to getting into law school, they invoke this iconic character. That man said it. He told us that too. And I think it is sort of an extraordinary idea to think that your father was able to create. I don't know of any other fictional character that has resonated that much. Stuart, do we know anything like this? I mean, there is an Atticus Finch phenomenon.
Other than Dumbledore? No.
Other than Dumbledore?
No.
Yeah, but nobody writes that for their essay for law school.
Wait.
Wait. And I'm wondering, we've spent some time talking about it, but and then I want to have the room talk for another 15 or 20 minutes before we finish up. But there is something about this, and I don't know if...
Well, I think you see the descendant of it in Sam Waterston's portrayal on Law and Order. There you have a more cranky version of Atticus Finch, right? But the same probity, the same sense of conviction about what he's doing, but more cranky, more toward the side that you mentioned at the end of the film, where he's willing to put his own son in jeopardy,
right?
Out of a sense of noblesse oblige. So this just is a way of saying that the character does seem to keep going in different forms.
Cecilia, when you and Barbara were making the film, what kinds of things did people tell you about this character, this iconic Atticus Finch? I mean, what have you and Anthony learned? Everybody must at some point have said to you something like that, some variation of that.
I think that film characters are very indelible, and in a way they are real, because if you think of a memory of, let's say, your grandfather that you barely knew, so you only know him through these distant recollections and maybe what you've heard, but you can live with someone like Atticus in your life and see the film over and over and feel that you understand him as a man and can emulate him and maybe choose to in your own life. And I think that a character like Atticus really does become real.
Let's open up for the audience. Any questions? Yes. We have someone with a microphone. Is there somebody? Yeah, we go. Thank you.
Can I ask one question of Stuart and one question of the judge, if possible? You said something about what was going on in what had been done about interracial films and the South and all that by 1962, 63. And I was trying to think of what else had been done. Could you talk about what else had been done? Because the notion of how bold this was, I think, is an interesting one, and I think you can speak to that. And I'm, thinking of other films. I don't just mean in law, but, like, I don't know the date of Guess Who's Coming for Dinner. I mean, the one with Cynthia Poitier, but other films that talked about black and white. And for the judge, since you mentioned it, why are you not a fan of Alan Dershowitz? I find this very interesting.
You want to consider that?
Yeah, you want to wind up.
I think he urges his students. You what? I think he urges his students to skate on very thin ice, ethically.
In what way? Isn't that enough?
I can take care of myself.
No.
I said originally I declined to answer the question for various reasons. There was a wonderful movie where the great black actor played Mr. Tibbs, and he went down to Mississippi to solve a murder case. What was the name of that?
In the Heat of the Night.
In the heat of
In
the
the
night.
Heat of the Night.
Another Poitier.
Now, I don't know what year that was. That was around then. But my purpose in being here tonight, I'm not a film critic, and I don't know a lot about movies other than I like to go to them and enjoy them. I came because I thought that I was going to be asked questions about what happened in the courtroom as to whether these things could really happen. For instance, the testimony of the sheriff at the trial, there were 4 witnesses at the trial, right? The testimony of the sheriff was all inadmissible. It was all hearsay. I assume everybody realized that. Now, in a film, you have to put everything in to save time, and there was probably more legal action in this film than in most other films that you'll ever see, other than that wonderful Tyrone Power Lawton film about Britain after the war, with witness for the prosecution. There was a lot of legal stuff in that. An awful lot of what the DA did. I mean, if anybody ever did that in a courtroom that I've ever been in, and I've been practicing, I practiced in the Army in the mid-1950s when I was overseas, I practiced I practiced 51 years here in New York. Remember how the guy was biting on the stick? Mm-hmm. Remember that? If anybody ever pulled that in a real court in New York, he'd be in the pokey faster than
Tom Robinson.
Than Mr. Robinson. Did you remember how he sat? Did you notice that?
Yeah.
Leg up? Yeah. I mean, the whole thing was absurd. And it played, of course, what it did was it played up for the audience wonderfully the way the South was in 1933. And the idea that he called the defendant boy, I mean, that was so insulting. I mean, I saw the movie, I guess, 20 years ago, 30 years ago first, and I've seen it once or twice at home until Sunday. And I mean, when I saw that Sunday night, that got me right in the gut when the prosecutor said that. I mean, if a prosecutor ever did that, I mean, he'd be finished. So, sure, the movie pointed up the terrible conditions that existed in the American South in the early all through the 1930s, just not the middle of the early 1930s. And it was a wonderful movie for that purpose.
Why it's so rare that we see a moral attorney as a character in films. For example, we see them in the Verdict, but he has to wrestle with himself. He has to come out of the sewer, really. And I'm curious why you think it's not more often on screen.
You have thoughts, anyone?
Well,
I definitely have thoughts, but I'm much more interested in what you have to say.
I think that right after this film was made, a new generation of filmmakers came into prominence, like your friend Mr. Lumet and Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola, and the central characters in films began to be more anti-heroes. So I think it was a function of the times changing. I do feel like today there's a yearning for characters again, and people in our world, in our country, who have that kind of integrity. But I think for a long time it went the other way.
Could I just say one thing? I think you forget. You look too young to remember. Perry Mason was tremendously popular for years and years and years. And there was nothing immoral about Perry Mason. Some of the stuff that he pulled was impossible in a real world. But there was nothing immoral or amoral about Perry Mason. So it just seems that right now society prefers to see the nasty lawyers. The Verdict, what was that, 15 years ago, the Newman movie?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
15 years ago?
Actually, more, 25.
like 20,
25,
yeah.
all right. So.
Sir? Stuart, did you have something you wanted to add to that in particular?
Perry Mason is very much the point, I think. But with something like The Verdict, what we're really dealing with is not a nasty, immoral lawyer. What we're dealing with is a redemption story, right? So that's a different type of reassurance that you get from a redemption story. But that's what that one is about.
In fact,
so
I would,
it's,
sorry.
you know, go ahead.
I would just say most of those films that are more now the post-Atticus films are all where the lawyer is in desperate need of a second chance and is redeemed through it. We see A Few Good Men, A Civil Action, Aaron Brockovich. All of these films now have people who start backwards and somehow find their way to some kind of moral and ethical purity. Sir?
Yes, this is for Your Honor. I'm almost as old as you, but not quite. In view of the verdict in this movie and some recent verdicts that we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years, where verdicts have come in trials such as the O.J. Simpson case, and there are many, many others, what are your views on jury nullification? And do you think that jury nullification would even the playing field in communities where maybe people's view of social justice is a little different than what our justice system says it is?
I'm not in favor of jury nullification. To the degree that the movie that we just saw involved jury nullification, there was jury nullification because the poor soul wasn't guilty, and the prosecution never proved the case. So yeah, that was an example of jury nullification. If we never saw the charge of law. We have no idea what the charge of law was because the movie didn't show that. We never heard what the prosecutor's summation was. But based upon what we saw, it was jury nullification because clearly he was innocent and he was found guilty. In the Simpson case, that was another example to me of jury nullification. I don't think jury nullification is such a great idea.
Yes, Kenny.
Yeah, we talk a lot in Dane's class about the difference between morals and ethics and how one can be an ethical attorney and not necessarily be moral. And I keep thinking about Richard Gere's role in Primal Fear, where the first thing he says to a defendant who he believes to be guilty is, I don't want to know if you did it or not. And I'm thinking to myself a lot, how are we as future attorneys supposed to deal with people who we know are not good people, who we know the moral road will not be to represent them and get them off? And how are we supposed to deal with issues like that?
You want Cecilia to answer that. I knew she was dying for that one. Nail it, Peck. I don't know. You know, that was why we threw out the Dershowitz thing. I mean, honestly, those were the two films that really needed to be side by side was Reversal of Fortune and this. I mentioned the other day that, you know, it does strike me that that film is the anti-Atticus film. That is a film of, I like the way Judge Keenan mentioned it, but it does seem as if, you know, the truth doesn't matter. So many things that you think morally or ethically should matter doesn't matter. All that matters is presenting a defense and crushing the other side, and that the winning side ultimately prevails, and that's the truth that really matters, because truth itself is always so obscure and hard to define. So I don't know, it's tough, but I will say this, only that filmmakers are definitely interested in this. This line between the legal and the moral and the ethical is clearly where filmmakers go. Yes, ma'am.
Perry Mason was actually from the 1950s, and he is why I became a lawyer.
Now, he was from the 1930s. Originally, the books were by Earl Stanley Gardner in the 1930s. They started in the 1930s. There was a whole series of books by Earl Stanley Gardner, and then gradually they became television programs. There were even a couple of Perry Mason movies.
Valeria.
Just for Cecilia Peck, I was wondering what was like for you the first time you saw your father in this role?
Great question.
If it was to see it in the theater or to see it like at home and
One of my students.
Well, great question.
And I'll tell you who she's not a student of, Alan Dershowitz. I just want to be clear.
Well, I saw it at home, and maybe my brother can help me remember. I know that there was a long time when we weren't allowed to see the film, and I think there's some very adult issues in it. But it's interesting that you even asked, because this whole room looks at the film in a certain way, but you could criticize or interpret or appreciate the film from a totally different perspective, as a film about parenting or a coming-of-age story of these children and the dawning of their consciousness. So, these legal issues, I think there are other people more qualified to talk about than me. But as far as seeing it, yes, we saw it at home. I remember being very, very frightened, by the scene in the woods and by the presence of evil in the film, and not completely understanding what Tom Robinson was being tried for. But I guess kind of looking at it like Scout from the balcony.
Well, that's actually true, right? I mean, there are shots from the balcony of the trial, as if we consistently see it from the perspective of the black community, and we see that repeatedly. Yes, there was a question right here. No? Yes, Yusuf.
For the film side as opposed to the law side, I noticed that the only person in this film that does not have a southern accent is Gregory Peck. Was that intentional, or was that Gregory Peck being Gregory Peck? Just like when you see the judge pointed out, you see the prosecutor with his leg on the point. Atticus is prim, proper, perfect posture, totally tie up to the neck. Was that an intentional way of separating the two, or just your father being your father?
Well, I could answer, but I'd kind of like to hear what The Nation has to say about that.
The critic from The Nation spent a fair amount of time in Alabama as a kid, and knows that there are various levels of Southern accents. I think that Gregory Peck deliberately chose not to overdo it, but he was also playing somebody who identifies himself right at the beginning of the film as somebody who lives in the town. He's a city person, he's the educated person. His accent would be a little more towards what we might consider normative English pronunciation. So I think he wasn't laying it on with the trowel. But I think that's part of the characterization. Then you have characters who overdo it. I would say that the actor playing Bob Ewell overdid everything, but was also urged to do everything. I mean, it was also almost silent movie time. Sometimes
children, if you hear them, they're definitely drawn. I mean, you can barely understand them at some points, while he is almost, for want of a better phrase, Bostonian in the sense of the prim and properness of his English. Besides it, but the character, according to the film, grew up there.
Well, the character, let's remember, also uses very elevated language habitually. Look at the scene in which he explains to Scout what a compromise is. And when she doesn't get it at first, he says something about an agreement mutually arrived at by consensus or something on that level, exactly the way you would explain something to a 6-year-old, of course. So, the character is written as a man who uses language at a certain level. So I think Peck is playing that.
Yes?
I was going to say that the actress who narrates it as a grown-up does not use a girl as thick as a little girl does.
Yeah, true. I was thinking also when something that Cecilia said after Valeria prompted such a great answer. Your film that you and Barbara made, the novel is really about the looking back. It's about this idea that you don't really know your parents until it takes decades later. The 9-year-old Scout doesn't understand the Atticus who would risk everything to represent a stranger and who would, accept, potatoes from a man who's in his debt and not even want to thank him because he doesn't want to embarrass him, and who would, and as you know in the novel, would make them go, hang out and read to Mrs. Dubose, this really inscrutable father who then makes sense. And I'm wondering whether you had that Scout moment, or what I will now call the Harper Lee moment, where the Koppel Peck film is an opportunity to come back and look at the man who was a monument when you were a little kid, but now was this elderly, distinguished gentleman who everyone cherished.
Barbara, do you want to help me answer?
We have another chair.
Go for it. Nail this one, Pat.
I came up with the whole phrase.
Yeah, I think that film, was a discovery of my father. We had a great experience with him when we showed him a rough cut of the film, and we were so nervous about it. And my father had not enjoyed so much the whole making of the film, and he called Barbara his little torturer, and he referred, it was filmed around him doing this evening of storytelling to an audience and answering questions about his life and career. But Barbara would always try to get him backstage and at home, and he called those the sidebars and never understood why we had to film the sidebars. He thought that stage show. And then in the end, those moments with my mother and off stage were his favorite ones. And he actually called the film his second favorite film after To Kill a Mockingbird. But when we showed him this film in rough cut that he hadn't been part of putting together at all, he watched it, and we expected, I guess, lots of notes and criticisms. But he had one request. He said, I would really like for you to include a portion of the speech I gave about stricter gun control measures in our country. And, he was just so wonderful that way. He wasn't going to get involved in the storytelling of the film, but the things that he really cared about, he would, stand up for.
But for you personally, was it some kind of Harper Lee journey? Did you know him differently in these sidebars with Barbara Koppel? Did you find a different Gregory Peck?
I really think for me it was my opportunity and Barbara's to share, the father I knew with an audience and a public who maybe didn't know those sides of him. He was very so warm and so loving, and his I think the main his great happiness in his life came from his marriage to my mother, and that's very much part of the film too.
Let's take one more. Yes, one more.
For Ms. Peck, I was wondering if your father ever talked about working with the three children as far as I would say it's one of the most realistic, for child acting I've ever seen. As far as it's just spot on.
Well, yes, he was very close to them, and by the way, and Mary Badham, who was nominated for an Academy Award, is so absolutely remarkable in this film. But I also think that Philip Alford, who played Jem, is maybe the unsung great actor in this film as well. His moments just convey so much, and like you were talking about when he sees how his dad can shoot, that.
I just think that is an incredible. I think the film is about that idea that when he says you can't. Everybody quotes that line about you never know a man until you walk in his shoes, until you're inside his skin, and the whole movie is about this sort of dual complexity of people that you're afraid of but you shouldn't be afraid of, people who you don't know that you should be afraid of, you ought to be, and there's an example that even the children didn't know that their father was the best shot in the whole county, and they wouldn't know that.
But he stayed very close to the entire family of To Kill a Mockingbird for his whole life, and Mary Badham, and as well as Brock Peters, who remained his best friend. And my father's one request about his own passing was that Brock deliver his eulogy, which he did. Wow.
didn't know that.
He was the only speaker at my father's service, and we all have been very close friends with Harper Lee for our whole lives. My son is named Harper, and by the way, Harper, who's from Monroeville, Alabama, speaks in a very elegant, musical, beautiful dialect that's not terribly Southern, but and I know that my dad had met her father as well, and I think you had answered that question, but I just wanted to mention Harper. And yes, those children were like children to him, and Mary Badham called my dad Atticus for her whole life. She couldn't think of him any other way.
I'm afraid this incredible evening is going to have to come to an end. Before we go, there's a few announcements, and then we can applaud like all hell. First of all, I should thank our guests. First, Judge the Honorable John Keenan, and Stuart Claywans, and Cecilia Pack.